Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to d2. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop f1 to d3. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight g1 to e2. Pawn c5 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Knight d7 to b6. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to e7. Pawn a2 to a3. Bishop c8 to d7. Queen d1 to c2. Rook a8 to c8. Queen c2 to b1. Pawn h7 to h5. Pawn b2 to b3. Pawn h5 to h4. Bishop c1 to b2. Pawn a7 to a5. Rook f1 to c1. Pawn h4 to h3. Pawn g2 to g3. Pawn a5 to a4. Pawn b3 to b4. Pawn g7 to g5. Rook a1 to a2. Knight c6 to a7. Pawn f2 to f4. Knight a7 to b5. Rook c1 takes c8. Queen d8 takes c8. Queen b1 to c2. Queen c8 takes c2. Bishop d3 takes c2. Pawn g5 takes f4. Knight e2 takes f4. Bishop e7 to g5. Knight d2 to f3. Bishop g5 takes f4. Pawn g3 takes f4. Bishop d7 to c6. King g1 to f1. Rook h8 to g8. Knight f3 to g5. Rook g8 to h8. Knight g5 to f3. Rook h8 to g8. Knight f3 to g5. Rook g8 to h8. Knight g5 to f3. The game is a draw.